When we talk about the role of Hezbollah in this conflict, we're not just talking about another armed group in the region. We're talking about one of the most capable, deeply embedded, and strategically significant non-state actors in modern geopolitics. And that changes the equation entirely because Hezbollah is not operating in isolation. It is closely aligned with Iran, and that relationship gives it something most groups in the region do not have: sustained support, advanced capabilities, and strategic alignment with a state actor that is itself engaged in a broader regional contest. Now, let's be clear about what that means in practical terms. Hezbollah is not simply a symbolic presence near Israel's northern border. It is a force that has developed over decades, militarily, organizationally, and politically. It has experience in asymmetric warfare. It has access to advanced weapons systems, and it has a level of battlefield coordination that allows it to operate in a way that blurs the line between a non-state actor and a quasi-military force. And that distinction matters because when a group like this operates from within Lebanon, it introduces a unique form of strategic pressure. It forces Israel to consider not just one front, but multiple fronts simultaneously. And in any military strategy, the more fronts you have to defend, the more difficult your position becomes. Now, from a psychological standpoint, Hezbollah's proximity to Israel is just as important as its capabilities because geography changes perception. When threats are far away, they can be managed, they can be monitored, they can be contained within a broader strategic framework. But when a capable adversary is located directly across a border, one that can strike, respond, and escalate quickly, the sense of immediacy changes. The threat becomes more tangible, more urgent, more personal, and that in turn influences decision-making because leaders are not just responding to capabilities, they are responding to proximity, to risk, and to pressure. Now, Hezbollah's role is also deeply embedded in the broader strategy of Iran because for Iran, Hezbollah represents more than just an ally. It represents forward defense, a way to project power beyond its own borders without direct engagement. And this is where the concept of deterrence becomes critical. Deterrence is not just about having the ability to strike. It's about convincing your adversary that the cost of action will outweigh the benefits. And Hezbollah contributes to that calculus because it gives Iran the ability to signal consequences without necessarily acting directly. If pressure is applied to Iran, the response does not have to come solely from Iranian territory. It can come from its network, from its allies, from its strategic partners. And that creates a kind of layered deterrence, one that is more complex, more flexible, and in some ways more difficult to predict. But it also introduces risk because when you empower multiple actors within a strategy, you also distribute control, and distributed control is inherently harder to manage. Now, let's look at how this affects Israel. For Israel, Hezbollah represents a persistent and an evolving challenge, not just a threat, but a constant strategic consideration, because unlike a conventional army, Hezbollah operates within a civilian environment. It blends into the infrastructure of Lebanon. It operates within a political system, and it draws both local and regional legitimacy from its positioning. This creates a dilemma because any response to Hezbollah carries not just military implications, but political and humanitarian ones as well. And that complicates the response because in modern conflict, perception matters almost as much as action. Now, from a broader perspective, Hezbollah's role also reflects a shift in how wars are fought. We are no longer in an era where conflicts are defined solely by state-to-state engagement. And instead, we are in an era where non-state actors play a central role in shaping outcomes. And in that environment, groups like Hezbollah become critical nodes in a much larger system. Like, they are not just participants in conflict, they are instruments of strategy. And that means their actions cannot be viewed in isolation. They must be understood as part of a larger pattern, one that includes Iran's broader regional objectives, the responses of Israel, and the involvement of other global powers like the United States. Now, here's where it becomes particularly important to understand the psychological dimension of Hezbollah's role, because part of its effectiveness lies not just in what it does, but in what it represents. It represents resilience, it represents persistence, and for some, it represents resistance. And And those narratives matter because in conflict, narratives shape legitimacy, and legitimacy shapes endurance. So Hezbollah's influence is not just military, it is also ideological, and that gives it staying power. Now, there is also a broader strategic implication here that we cannot ignore, because the presence of a group like Hezbollah means that escalation is always possible, even if it is not immediate. It means that tensions can remain high, even during periods of relative calm. And it means that the risk of miscalculation is always present, because in a system this complex, a single event, a strike, a response, a misinterpretation can trigger a chain reaction that spreads quickly across the region. And once that chain begins, it becomes very difficult to stop. So when we think about Hezbollah's role in this conflict, we are really thinking about something much larger. We are thinking about the architecture of modern warfare, the way state and non-state actors interact, the way geography, psychology, and strategy intersect, and the way power is distributed across a network rather than concentrated in a single center. And that changes everything, because in this kind of system, control is no longer absolute. It is negotiated, it is contested, and it is constantly evolving. So the real question is not just what Hezbollah is capable of doing. The question is what happens when a capable, ideologically driven, strategically positioned actor operates within an already volatile system, because that is where the true dynamics of this conflict begin to unfold. And that is where the future of the region will ultimately be shaped. And if there is one thing to take away from this, it is this: in a world defined by networks, the actors who matter most are not always the ones at the center, but the ones who can move the system when it matters most. When we step back from Hezbollah specifically and look at the broader picture, what we begin to see is not just one actor, but a network, a system of aligned groups that extends across the region. And that system fundamentally changes how this conflict unfolds. Because Iran is not operating alone, it is working through a web of relationships, partnerships, and alignments that stretch across multiple countries and multiple battlefields. And that web includes groups in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and, of course, Lebanon through Hezbollah. Now, this is where modern conflict becomes more complex than traditional war, because in the past, wars were often defined by clear lines: state against state, uniform against uniform. But today, we are looking at something far more fluid. We are looking at a system where multiple actors can act simultaneously, sometimes in coordination, sometimes independently, but always within a shared strategic context. And that matters. Because when pressure is applied to one point in this network, it doesn't stay there. It spreads, it diffuses, and sometimes it intensifies in unexpected places. Now, from a strategic standpoint, this gives Iran a very important advantage. It allows for what we might call distributed pressure. Instead of concentrating force in one location, pressure can be applied across multiple fronts. And that forces adversaries like the United States and its regional partners to do something extremely difficult: divide their attention, because now they are not dealing with a single threat. They are dealing with multiple overlapping threats, some visible, some less so, some immediate, some potential. And in a system like that, uncertainty becomes the defining feature, because it is no longer clear where the next escalation will come from. Now, that uncertainty has real consequences, because in geopolitics, uncertainty forces caution. It forces states to prepare for worst-case scenarios. It forces them to allocate resources defensively rather than proactively. And over time, that changes the balance of power, not through a single dramatic event, but through accumulated pressure. Now, let's talk about how these regional allies actually function within the system. In many cases, they operate with a degree of autonomy. They have their own leadership structures, their own local priorities, their own strategic calculations. But they also share alignment with Iran's broader objectives. And that alignment is what makes the system powerful, because it allows for coordination without direct centralization. And that's a crucial distinction, because centralized systems are easier to understand, but also easier to disrupt. Distributed systems, on the other hand, are harder to predict, harder to fully control, but often more resilient. And resilience in this context is a form of strategic strength. Now, what does this look like in practice? It means that when tensions rise in one part of the region, whether in Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, it doesn't remain isolated. It interacts with other fronts, it influences decision-making elsewhere, and it contributes to an overall sense that the region is interconnected in ways that cannot be easily compartmentalized. And that interconnectedness is critical, because it means that escalation is rarely linear. It doesn't move in a straight line from point A to point B. Instead, it moves in patterns, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always in ways that reflect the underlying network of relationships. Now, from the perspective of adversaries, this creates a significant challenge, because how do you respond to a network? Do you respond to each actor individually? Do you try to address the central influence? Or do you attempt to contain the system as a whole? Each of those options comes with trade-offs. And none of them are easy, because targeting individual actors can lead to fragmentation of the problem, but not necessarily resolution. Targeting the central actor risks broader escalation, and attempting to contain the entire system requires coordination, patience, and a level of regional cooperation that is difficult to sustain. So what we end up with is a kind of strategic tension, a situation where pressure is constantly applied, but resolution remains elusive. Now, there's another layer here that is often overlooked. These regional alliances are not just military in nature. They are also political and sometimes ideological, and that matters because it affects how durable these relationships are. When actors share not just strategic interests, but also ideological or political alignment, their cooperation tends to be more resilient over time. But it also makes conflict more complex, because now the stakes are not just about territory or power. They are about identity. And when identity becomes part of the equation, compromise becomes harder. Now, consider the implications of that for regional stability. If you have a network of aligned groups operating across multiple countries, each with their own internal dynamics, each responding to local pressures, but all connected through a broader strategic framework, then the potential for escalation is always present, even if it's not always visible, even if it's not always immediate. And that creates a kind of persistent instability, not a constant explosion, but a constant readiness. A system that is always on edge, always reacting, always recalibrating. And that has consequences, because in such an environment, trust becomes fragile. Misinterpretation becomes more likely, and small events can have outsized effects. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, what we are really seeing here is a shift in how power operates. Power is no longer just about control over territory. It is about control over networks, about influence across systems, about the ability to shape outcomes indirectly rather than directly. And Iran's regional alliances are a clear example of that shift, because they demonstrate how influence can be extended without full visibility, how pressure can be applied without direct confrontation, and how conflict can be sustained over time without necessarily escalating into full-scale war. But there's always a limit, because the more complex the system becomes, the harder it is to manage. And the more actors you involve, the greater the chance that something will go wrong. A miscalculation, a misinterpretation, an unintended consequence. And that is where the real risk lies, because in a networked conflict, it is not always the central actors who determine the outcome. Sometimes it is the interactions between the nodes, the connections, the overlaps, the moments where things don't go according to plan. And when that happens, the system can shift in ways that no one fully anticipated. So when we look at Iran's regional alliances, we are not just looking at a strategy, we are looking at a system that is powerful, adaptable, and deeply embedded in the regional landscape, but also one that is inherently complex. And in complexity, there is both strength and vulnerability. And the challenge for everyone involved is understanding where that balance lies. Because once you cross a certain threshold of complexity, control becomes something very difficult to maintain. And that is the real question this conflict raises. In a system that's interconnected, who is truly in control and who is simply reacting to forces they can no longer fully see or contain. When we talk about proxy warfare in this conflict, we're really talking about a very specific kind of strategic behavior, one that sits right at the edge of escalation, but rarely crosses it outright. It's a space where actors test each other, probe for weaknesses, and signal intent without fully committing to a broader war. And in that space, groups like Hezbollah play a central role because proxy actors are not just extensions of state power. They are instruments of calibrated pressure. Now, think about how this plays out in practice. Like when Iran responds to threats or attacks, it doesn't always respond directly, and it doesn't always respond at full force. Instead, it often works through aligned groups across the region, creating what we might call a ladder of escalation. At each step on that ladder, there is a decision point, a moment where actors choose, do we escalate further or do we hold? And that is where deterrence becomes more than just theory. It becomes a lived, ongoing calculation because deterrence is not static. It is dynamic. It is constantly being tested. Now, one of the key features of proxy warfare is that it allows for action without full commitment. It allows a state to signal strength without triggering immediate full-scale retaliation. And that is a powerful tool because it creates flexibility, but it also creates ambiguity. And ambiguity in a system like this is both useful and dangerous. Useful because it allows actors to maintain strategic options. Dangerous because it increases the risk of miscalculation. Now let's consider how this applies to the broader region, particularly in relation to the United States and its allies. When proxy groups carry out attacks, whether in Iraq, Syria, or elsewhere, it is not always immediately clear how to respond because responding too forcefully risks escalation, but responding too weakly risks signaling weakness. And in geopolitics, signals matter because every action sends a message and every message shapes future behavior. So what you end up with is a delicate balancing act, a kind of strategic tension where each side is trying to influence the other's perception without crossing a threshold that leads to uncontrollable escalation. And that threshold is what we often refer to as a red line. But here's the challenge. Red lines are rarely explicit. They are often implied, interpreted, sometimes even misunderstood. And that introduces risk because if one side misreads the other's threshold, it can take actions that unintentionally escalate the conflict. And once escalation begins, it can be very difficult to stop. Now, Hezbollah and other regional actors operate within this framework. They calibrate their actions, they observe responses, they adjust accordingly. And in doing so, they help maintain a kind of continuous pressure on the system. Not enough to trigger full-scale war, but enough to keep the tension alive. And that's an important distinction because this is not about winning a decisive battle. It's about shaping the environment, influencing behavior, and maintaining leverage over time. Now, from a psychological perspective, this creates a constant state of alert for both sides because when attacks can come from multiple directions, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies, it becomes harder to predict the next move. And unpredictability creates stress, not just on military systems, but on political systems as well, because leaders are forced to make decisions under uncertainty. And in those moments, judgment becomes critical. Now, there is also a deeper philosophical question here. What does it mean to be in a state of constant near conflict? Because that is what proxy warfare often produces, not full peace, not full war, but something in between, a persistent tension, a kind of strategic limbo. And that has consequences because systems that exist in prolonged tension tend to become more fragile over time. Small events can have larger impacts, minor incidents can escalate quickly, and the margin for error becomes smaller. Now, let's bring this back to Iran's broader strategy. By operating through proxy networks, Iran can influence multiple theaters simultaneously. It can apply pressure or without fully committing its own forces, and it can sustain that pressure over time. But that also means it is engaged in a long game because proxy warfare is not about immediate outcomes. It is about shaping the trajectory of the conflict. gradually, incrementally, over time, and that requires patience, but it also requires control, and control is not always guaranteed because proxy actors have their own agency, their own motivations, their own interpretations of events. And while they may align with Iran's broader objectives, they are not always perfectly synchronized, and that introduces another layer of uncertainty. Now, consider the impact of this on Israel's strategic thinking. For Israel, proxy warfare means that threats are not always clearly defined. They can emerge from different locations at different times in different forms, and that makes defense more complex because you are not just defending against one actor, you are defending against a network. And that network is adaptive, which means your own strategy must also be adaptive. Now, from a broader regional perspective, this creates a kind of strategic equilibrium, but it is not a stable equilibrium. It is a dynamic one, constantly shifting, constantly being tested, and constantly at risk of tipping in one direction or another. And that is the core of proxy warfare, not decisive victory, but controlled instability, a balance between action and restraint. Pressure and pause, escalation and de-escalation. But here is the key insight. The longer this balance is maintained, the more strain it places on the system, because tension, when sustained, does not disappear. It accumulates. And at some point, accumulated tension demands resolution, not always in a controlled way, sometimes in a sudden shift, a breaking point, a moment where the system can no longer absorb the pressure it has been under. And that is the risk embedded in proxy warfare. It allows for gradual escalation, but it also creates the conditions for sudden escalation. And when that moment comes, it is often unpredictable. So when we look at Hezbollah, Iran, and the broader network of aligned actors, we are not just looking at isolated incidents. We are looking at a system of managed conflict, a system designed to apply pressure without triggering collapse, but a system that by its very nature is always operating close to the edge. And that is where the danger lies, because systems that live on the edge are also the ones most susceptible to tipping over it. And in a conflict like this, the question is not just how long the balance can be maintained, it's what happens when it can't be. Because once that, balance breaks, the consequences are no longer confined to one actor or one region, that they spread. And when they spread, they reshape the entire system. So the real question we are left with is this: in a world where war is no longer declared, but instead managed, how close are we really to the moment when management gives way to something far more difficult to control? When we step back and look at the broader consequences of this escalation, particularly the involvement of actors like Hezbollah and other regional allies, we begin to see that this is no longer just a military confrontation. It's a political, psychological, and even philosophical moment for the entire region. Because what's really at stake here is not just territory or power, it's stability, it's perception, and it's the question of how far this system can be pushed before it starts to respond in ways that no one can fully control. Now, consider the regional dimension. For countries in the Middle East, particularly those closely watching the actions of Iran and its network of aligned groups, this conflict is not distant. It is immediate. It is something that shapes national security decisions, economic planning, and diplomatic strategy. Because when a regional escalation begins to unfold, it does not stay confined to one border. It ripples outward. And that ripple effect forces governments to make choices under pressure. Do they strengthen alliances? Do they increase military readiness? Or do they attempt to stay neutral in a situation where neutrality itself becomes difficult to maintain? These are not abstract questions. They are real, urgent, and consequential. Now, from the perspective of global powers like the United States, the challenge is equally complex because the United States is not just responding to isolated events. It is responding to a system that includes state actors, non-state actors, and everything in between. And in a system like this, every response carries weight because every action has the potential to either stabilize or further destabilize the situation. Now, let's talk about the psychological dimension of this conflict, because warfare is not just about physical outcomes. It's about perception. It's about how actors interpret each other's behavior. In a system like this, perception can sometimes matter more than reality. For example, when a group like Hezbollah is active along a border, or when regional allies begin to mobilize, it sends a signal, not just about capability, but about intent. And intent is what shapes response, because if a state believes that its adversary intends to escalate, it will prepare accordingly. And that preparation in itself can be interpreted as escalation. So what you end up with is a feedback loop. Action leads to reaction. Reaction leads to counter reaction, and the cycle continues. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, this raises an important question. How do you maintain stability in a system that is constantly in motion? Because the Middle East is not static. It is a dynamic environment shaped by history, influenced by ideology, and constantly evolving based on the actions of multiple actors. And in that kind of environment, stability is not something that happens by default. It has to be actively managed, maintained, negotiated. And that is incredibly difficult, because every actor in the system is pursuing its own interests, its own security, its own vision of the future, and those visions do not always align. Now, when we think about escalation, we often think of it as a series of steps, a gradual increase in intensity, but in reality, escalation is not always linear. Sometimes it is sudden. A single event can shift the entire trajectory of a conflict, a miscalculation, a misinterpretation, an unexpected response. And in a system this interconnected, the potential for that kind of shift is always present. Now, the presence of Hezbollah and other regional allies adds another layer to this, because they introduce additional decision makers into the equation, additional points of action, additional sources of potential escalation, and that increases the number of variables that must be managed at any given time. And when you increase the number of variables, you increase complexity. And when complexity increases, predictability decreases. And when predictability decreases, risk increases. So we are dealing with system that is inherently unstable, not because any one actor wants it to be, but because of the structure of the system itself. Now, from a strategic perspective, all actors involved are trying to manage this instability, to control it, to shape it, to prevent it from tipping into full-scale war. But that requires coordination, communication, and in some cases, restraint. And restraint is one of the most difficult things to maintain in a high pressure environment, because when you are under threat, the instinct is to respond, to act, to assert control. But sometimes the most strategic decision is to hold back, to wait, to observe. And that kind of discipline is rare. Now let's consider the broader implications, because this conflict is not happening in isolation. It is part of a larger global environment that is increasingly defined by competition, uncertainty, and fragmentation. And in that environment, regional conflicts can have global consequences. Energy markets can be affected, trade routes can be disrupted, alliances can be tested, and the balance of power can shift. So what we are seeing here is not just a regional issue, it is a global one. Now, the most important question we have to ask is this: how does this end? Because conflicts like this do not resolve themselves easily. They require negotiation, they require compromise, and they require a willingness to de-escalate. But when trust is low and tensions are high, that becomes difficult, very difficult. And that is where the real challenge lies, because while military actions may dominate the headlines, the true path to stability lies in diplomacy, in dialogue, in understanding. But those are not easy to achieve in the midst of conflict. Now, here is the deeper insight. In a system defined by complexity, the most powerful actors are not always the ones with the most force. They are the ones who can manage the system itself, who can understand the dynamics, who can anticipate the consequences, and who can act with both strength and restraint, because in the end, this is not just about winning or losing, it's about shaping the future. And the choices made today will determine not just the outcome of this conflict, but the stability of the region for years to come. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: in a world where every action creates a reaction, the real question is not just what we do, but whether we fully understand what we are setting in motion.